morning, you might grab your New Testaments and turn to the book of Titus. Delighted to have the opportunity to be with you and to have this time to study together. Brother Colby asked me about songs that he could lead, and I looked at the one at the end, and just as a sum total of the songs that he's going to lead us in and has led us in this morning, they were perfect for what we want to talk about in our time together today. At the beginning of the year, I started a series on covering the book of Titus that I have called His Grace Reaches and Teaches Me. And so we just sang about God's grace. And I get that idea of the theme of the book from Titus chapter 2 and verse 11 that I think really is right at the core of what Paul's trying to communicate to Titus, where he says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. His grace reaches me, instructing us or teaching us," His grace teaches me, "that denying ungodliness and worldly desires, we should live sensibly, righteously, and godly in this present age." So His grace reaches and teaches me. That's even in the song that we just sang. His grace reaches me and will last through eternity. Now I'm under His control, and I'm happy in my soul just to feel and to know that His grace reaches me. That is the idea, I think, of the book of Titus, is that God's grace, His gift of Christ as King, who brings us into this new family to be a people zealous for good works, His grace reaches us, and we can take that gift. We can accept that gift. And if we do, then it will instruct us all along the way. We see that also in chapter 3. But we spent some bit of time discussing that on the last occasion we looked at the book of Titus. So if you need a refresher on that, it is available on YouTube or our website. So go check that out. What I want to do is move to the work that Titus had been left to do in Crete, on the island of Crete, that Paul begins to talk about in verse 5. And in verse 5, he says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man is beyond reproach, the husband of one wife, having faithful children who are not accused of dissipation or rebellious. For the overseer must be beyond reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of dishonest gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, righteous, holy, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and reprove those who contradict." Paul leaves Titus behind on the island of Crete after their work together, really for one major purpose: to set in order the things that remain, and in order to do so, to appoint elders in every town or in every city. Elders who, I think, if we look at the way that they are described, were to be leaders in that grace and teaching that the book is all about. Leaders in grace and teaching, and I want to talk about that for a little while. Let me think more broadly about elders, and as we see them in the New Testament. He says appoint elders for every town. I assume that means that there would basically be a church per town. We see that in a similar way in Acts 14. Remember that they went preaching in those churches of southern Galatia, places like Lystra, Iconium, Derbe. And it says after they had made disciples in those places, that they went back through them and they appointed elders in every church. Basically, it looks like there was one church established in each town, and as they made their way back through, they appointed elders in those churches. Those elders were also called shepherds. One group of churches, one church group of elders that Paul met with was the elders at Ephesus. And in Acts chapter 20, Paul talks to them about their work, and that their work is to shepherd the flock of God that was among them. They were to be caretakers. They were to be overseers, shepherds, superintendents, maybe we could think of them as, watching over the flock that was among them. And that was their care and their responsibility. And then in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, Peter, who was an elder himself, probably at the church at Jerusalem, at least during the large majority of his life. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 1, he says, I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and as a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, overseeing not under compulsion, but willingly, according to God, and not for dishonest gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. There's a lot that we could say about elders. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, there's a parallel account of the qualifications for elders. And while we will talk about qualifications, I'm going to try to focus on the book of Titus this morning and really not do a lot of cross comparison with Timothy, because I want to see how what Paul has to say about elders fits into this message of grace and teaching. Because it may seem strange in some ways to have this high and noble idea of us being a people for God's own possession, and then the first thing he talks about is logistics. Right? The first thing he talks about is organization. And I think there are a lot of people out there who would hear a group like us and talk about us as we look at the qualifications for elders and what kind of men they must be and the work that they're supposed to do. And I think they would say, y'all are so persnickety about that. Y'all are so particular about that. You're so concerned about all these regulations for who these people can be. And what I would say is, in one of the books where Paul emphasizes how God's grace reaches and teaches us the most, where he starts is, and here's who you need leading. Here's who you need in place in this position of elders. It's a very important concern that Paul has, is getting these men in the right place. And it helps us to think about their work. I think if we think about it in the context of this book about grace and teaching, we are going to see that they are, notice this just in the book of Titus, chapter 1 and verse 7. The overseer must be beyond reproach as God's steward. We've talked a lot about the idea of stewardship, being a manager, a caretaker for something that is somebody else's. Well, they have shown themselves to be God's steward, perhaps in the care of the things that God has blessed them with. But our elders here, what are they? They are God's steward of us. We're not theirs in one sense. We're God's. We're God's people. We're Christ's people. And yet we have been entrusted into the hands of men who are to caretake for us. We have been put under their control to some degree. And they are to be stewards, God's manager for us. And so they are entrusted with you and me. They're entrusted with our souls. And we are to be people who are shaped by grace and by instruction, by grace and by teaching. And they have the responsibility of helping manage us in that. So it's a very important thing. And so what kind of men were they to be? What kind of work were they called to be involved in? Can we see how they were men who, like Titus was called to preach about, were shaped by grace and teaching? And when we think about these elders, they would have been those who had experienced God's grace and teaching and now were taking the lead in demonstrating God's grace and teaching. And I want to show how all that works together. First of all, let's say that these were men who were recipients of God's grace and teaching. How do we know that? Well, I want you to remember what the people in Crete were like. They were liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. And then I want you to look at how these men were described. I hope you have your text open there. What were the men who were appointed elders to be like? Well, they certainly weren't supposed to be evil beasts, were they? In fact, they were not to be driven by their own feelings and by their own instincts like an animal would be. They were not to be self-willed, which I think is basically what an animal is. They were not to be quick-tempered, which if you've ever gotten across a wild cat, that's exactly what they are. They were not to be pugnacious, which is a word I use to describe animals all the time. They were not to be violent, right? You just watch an episode on National Geographic of the savannah and see if we don't see some violence. They're not to be evil beasts controlled only by their feelings, only by their instincts, only by their needs, only by their wants, only by their desires. Rather, they are, as we see here in the text, they are to be self-controlled. They are going to be holy. That is, they have set themselves apart from the sinful world for God's specific purposes. So you think about on the island of Crete, what it would take for a man to be that in the face of all the evil beasts around him. Well, first of all, evil beasts, as far as humans go, what do they deserve? They deserve God's judgment. But they received God's grace. But they didn't just receive it. They had been taught by it. And they'd been shaped by it. Not only were they not evil beasts, they weren't lazy gluttons. Look at that qualification there. They're not addicted to wine. I think the strange thing that we see around us right now is that oftentimes the people who are addicted to wine or something that would be comparable to that causes them to lose control of their faculties is really, you hear a lot of country music that's like, well, I've worked so hard and I needed this break. That's not the way I see alcohol taking people. That's not the way I see hard drugs taking people. It's not that they're working hard. It's that they become lazy gluttons. And this is just a way to satisfy them or to quell some bad feelings or to make them feel better about the way that they're living their life. You go and see the people who are involved in this sort of thing, and they're lazy gluttons. These people don't desire dishonest gain. Compare that to the idea of a lazy glutton. How can you be lazy and a glutton? Well, you got to get fun somehow. And I think I know of people who want to imbibe in all the good things of life, but they don't want to work an hour for it. So what do? They find some scheme, or they find some way where they can be lazy and still soak in all of the nice things. Rather, these people are not lazy gluttons. They use what they have for hospitality. You think about that. Here's a man who has worked hard, maybe blood and sweat, and he's paid that price. And then he and his wife together, what they do is they take that and they say, let's have them over. Let's use this money to help them in this situation. Let's encourage them. You see how that's different than a lazy glutton? A lazy glutton says, don't come over here, this is my stuff. I'm going to get all this. I'm going to soak all this in. Not the man qualified to be an elder. Recognizing that what they had as God's possessions, that they were simply stewards and managers and caretakers of. And so they use their resources in that way. And they're certainly not a liar. They don't want dishonest gain. Notice the dishonest there. They're not going to tell an untruth for money's sake. They want what is good and right in God's eyes. They hold to the faithful word. Now, these were men who had come out of a world of liars, animals, and greedy bums to become men who love truth and love kindness and love self-control. What would it take to get there? They had to be recipients of grace and teaching. They had received the grace of God to be saved from sin, not just from its consequences, but from its control. Now, I want you to just think, what do these men sound like? They sound like people taught by grace. If you just read the words in Titus chapter 2, verse 11, instructing the denying ungodliness and worldly desires, we should live sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age. It's almost just like Paul copied and pasted what it took to be trained by grace into what it would take to be a leader of God's people. That they are looking for the blessed hope and the appearing of the glory and God of our Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us that he might redeem us from all lawlessness and purify for himself a people who were zealous for his own possession, zealous for good works. What are these men supposed to be like? They love what is good. They're hospitable. They're holy. They are people who have been recipients and have been taught by God's grace. Now I think we're seeing elders as models of grace and teaching in that they received it and let it shape their lives. They could be a leader in some ways just by being a model, just by living and saying, his grace reaches and teaches me. And you see how they're changed by it. Let me say second that they were men who had been trained in grace and teaching. And this is how I'm going to deal with the family qualifications. trained in grace and teaching. One, because I don't want to get into all the hairy questions about all of that. There are a lot of questions about it, right? What if the wife passes? What if he remarries? What if he's scripturally divorced and remarried? How many children? Faithful to whom? Are they being faithful to God or the Father? How many of them have to be faithful? What's the percentage there, right? 50%, 75%, 100%? What if one becomes unfaithful when they're 60, right? And this man's still serving as an... Then what? Not going to answer any of that. Brother Lonnie has all those answers. You can talk to him, and I can give you his email address, his phone number. You can have all that. Now, I think there are conclusions that we can come to about those things that I don't want to leave us like, well, we don't have any answers to this. We do. He is the husband of one wife. Now, I may not know all the things that excludes, but I know some things that excludes, right? I know it excludes a man who is married to somebody who's not his true wife, right? I know it excludes something like polygamy. I know things like that. When it talks about faithful children, I don't know exactly the amount and degree and all of that in certain ways. I do certainly think that it could include a man with one child, and I can make a case for that, I believe, pretty clearly from the scriptures. But what I would say is that it does exclude some children from allowing their father to be qualified. I would say that probably the word faithful there is often used to talk about faithful disciples of Jesus, but maybe it's about being faithful to the Father here. I would say maybe because of the qualification, you're not accused of dissipation or riotous, like they're not just living reckless rebel lives. But we'll say more about that in just a moment. So here is the man who has been faithful to his wife. He is called literally in the Greek the one-woman man. And if we're thinking about his work in hospitality, and we're thinking about the call in 1 Timothy 3 that he rules his house well, then I think we're thinking of a man and a wife who are on the same page spiritually, as best as can be. I would even say that if we look at 1 Timothy 3, there are some qualifications given for wives that I think probably apply to both deacons and elders' wives. And if that's the case, then she is a spiritual leader in her own way. And here he is with faithful children. As I may mention, it seems to me that that word is often used of believers. Let me just say this, that in most cases, faithfulness to a godly father would imply something about spiritual direction. And if they're not following that spiritual direction, then they're not faithful to me and to my instruction and my guidance. They wouldn't be faithful to the Lord. And I hope that's the case. I hope that being faithful to me or not being faithful to me would indicate something about their spiritual direction. But let me get to the point that I want to make here. To be the kind of father who is to be the kind of husband who is a one-woman man, who both are dedicated to hospitality and seeking good and to holiness and to godliness. To be that kind of father who has children who are faithful and not living like the rest of the Cretans around them. What do you have to learn? I think you have to learn how to administer both grace and teaching. You have to, in fact, become a gracious teacher. I am sure that that's the case with a husband and wife who are not in sync with each other. If he develops to this point where he is a one-woman man, devoted to her and faithful to her, and has led her to the point where they are ready to do this work together, then he has had to be kind and compassionate all along the way. And he's had to be faithful all along the way. I just want you to think, and most of you men know, and I think you women know as well. What would it take for a man to lead and guide his wife as they disagree along the way? And I'm not even talking about only spiritual things. Try building a house with a wife, right? What happens if they disagree along the way? It's true on ordinary subjects, and it would be especially true on spiritual truths. It's going to take teaching, and let me say it's going to take a healthy dose of grace and compassion and kindness. As healthy a dose as one can manage. At least that's what it's going to take if you want a spiritual partnership and not a tyrannical dictatorship, right? Can you teach and lead and instruct without grace? Yes. And a lot of godly women have to deal with a husband who's like that. But if you want a spiritual partnership where both are on the same page and he has learned to lead well, then he's going to be a gracious teacher in that. He's going to walk carefully and tread lightly and say truth, speak the truth in love. The same is true in developing a good father. Lane is not to this point yet. Not really. But the discipline and instruction and the teaching that I give my boys sometimes causes me to be rough. And there's a grandma here, so I won't say anything. But I think grandparents would look at me and go, ease up, man. Like the tone, the voice, the loudness, the level, the thing that follows all of that. But how do I balance that with grace? I'll tell you, that's the hard part for me. I love rules. I like instructions. I love obedience. I love high standards. But I have to be somebody who does not just have high expectations, but I have clear explanations of what's going on. And I think maybe some of us experienced that with our fathers who had high expectations for us and maybe didn't offer a lot of guidance in a lot of ways and show us the path. Lot can tell you a story about this just recently. He made a mistake, involved a large wad of peanut butter. I just let that go. And he didn't fix his mistake. He didn't tell the truth when confronted about it. And there was some serious teaching involved. But how can I give grace to that whole process? Buddy, it's not because of the peanut butter that you're in trouble. It's because we love truth. And we love doing right and meeting our responsibilities, even when we've made mistakes. So I asked him the next day, why'd you get in trouble? Because I spilled the peanut butter. No. Come on. It's not because you spilled the peanut butter. It's because you didn't correct the mistake when you had made it, and you didn't tell the truth when confronted about it. I love you. I want you to meet your responsibilities. I want you to do what's right, and I want you to tell the truth. I'm not somebody here, I'm not trying to expect perfection in every particular. I'm expecting you to say things like, I'm sorry, and please, and thank you, and I'll do better in the future. The other night, we had a lot of trying me to be patient when we spill something, we make a mess. And immediately when Leo spilled his drink, he jumped up and said, I'm sorry, it was an accident, I'll take care of it. Praised him. Thank you, buddy. It's exactly what I'm looking for. I do not have high demands that you won't ever spill a drink. I knocked my tea all over my desk at work the other day. Right? Don't have any expectations. But don't sit there and wait for somebody else to take care of the mess. You fix it. So what am I having to learn? I hope that in 20 years, if I'm qualified to be an elder, I hope that what happened is that through this process of trying to raise rascally boys, that I've learned how to teach with grace. Because I imagine that sometimes you have to deal with folks who you want to tell the truth, and it's hard to say it in just the right way as you're trying to be an elder, and you want to find a way to balance that. If a man is this kind of husband and father, he has learned something about this balance. He has been trained in grace and teaching. And what I'm not saying is that he's got to have a little grace and a little teaching. I'm saying his teaching has to be grace teaching. It has to be gracious teaching all along the way. Well, then finally, as an elder, he serves as a model, a guide and a leader, a shepherd with grace and teaching. This is the way the elders approach the people over whom they are called to lead. The things that they are not to be are important because it's almost impossible to be guided by grace in our relationship and be those things. Think about this. He says he cannot be arrogant. What do arrogant people do? Well, they look at the people who haven't made it to the place they've already made it, and they say, well, what's wrong with you? You must be some kind of loser here. If I've made it here, you should be able to make it here. And there's no sense of the idea of growth or development or opportunities that have been placed in their way that haven't been placed in the way of the other people. Maybe there's obstacles that they're having to face and overcome. Now, the elder does not cease to call people to that, but he doesn't approach it in arrogance. He doesn't do it from a place of pride. Quick-tempered, violent? That's pugnacious is other translation. Will he manage well with failure? You know, he's called this person to a standard. They've talked about it, and they fell again. What if he's quick-tempered and violent? Then what? How will he explain the instructions while speaking the truth in love? What if he's controlled by his addiction to alcohol? Will he be controlled by kindness? Will he be graciously instructive? Or a danger? What if he's greedy for financial gain? How could you even trust his teaching? The things that are given to us to be the description of the kind of man that he is supposed to be is one who is prepared to teach and be gracious at the same time. He will bring folks into his home and care for them in various ways. He's gracious. He loves what is good. You can trust his instruction and teaching. He has himself under control. He walks right. He's not entangled in the world or in sin. He's disciplined in his temper, in the way he uses his time, in his words. He is managed by grace and by instruction. I think that the idea of grace and teaching being so important in their work is because of the reason that Paul gives us here in verse 9. Holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and reprove those who contradict. He will be committed to giving instruction in public ways and in private settings because of his love for truth and because of his concern for the people entrusted to his care. Why would an elder be so concerned about somebody coming in and teaching false doctrine? Because they have been entrusted as stewards of our souls. And false doctrine pulls us away from the grace and teaching of God. Sometimes he will have to come down hard. We're going to look more at that next month when we look at the next portion of the book of Titus. He will have to silence the false teachers that may come in. But for a man of grace and teaching, he will not do so out of personal spite, but out of a commitment to hold tightly to the word that is trustworthy. He will see the danger that false teaching is to you and to me and to our families. It will be his experience and love for grace that will cause him to be a stalwart against teaching. He will rebuke it, and the world might look at that and say, how mean can you be? How legalistic can you be? And motivated all along by his love for truth and his love for you. Coming down hard at times. Because a failure to do so would show not only a lack of teaching, but it would show a lack of grace for those who could be pulled away. So we have 3 elders right now. Lonnie Oldag, Dwight Gilbert, Timmy Williams, and their wives, partners with them in their work. And I believe that as a group, we can look at them and we see models of gracious teachers. They have raised their families in ways that have demonstrated that. They have managed their resources in work or whatever they've done in that way. And as we read in the New Testament, the way we respond to those gracious leaders, we honor them, we thank them, we pray for them as we do regularly in this assembly, and we listen to their teaching that is shaped by God's grace. Let me tell you that we have leaders who are shaped not by a desire just to be the rulers of the local congregation, but to be our shepherds. Have you sat in any of the personal meetings with them as a family? I don't know how far they are through the list, but I think they've made their way pretty far down the list. And what they're doing is they're sitting there, they're asking you questions about their own work, about where you need help, about plans that we have, about directions that we're going. What kind of dictator does that? What kind of tyrannical lord does that? They are people who want to lead us in a way that is beneficial for us spiritually, ultimately. Think about the men's meetings that we have. I don't know if you know how many places that you can go where, and this is their prerogative, they can do what they want to. We are a local church. I'm only responsible for what's going on here in my teaching. they're responsible for what actually goes on here. I'm just here yelling. But how many places where you can go, and when the elders are appointed, the men's meetings stop? Because they're in charge now. They're the captains now. And yet here what we have is we have our elders who first have a meeting with the elders and deacons. And what they use that as is in our various roles, if it's my technology role, or if it's Austin checking on folks, or if it's Alan working with the website, or if it's Brother Gerald with the youth roster, or Brother Colby with the with the teacher list, or Lucas with the finances. What he can do is, okay, where are the issues? Now, I want you to keep in mind that they have put a lot of important work on other people because they have a more direct focus on our souls. So all these other men are doing this other work, and we're doing this, and we're able to bring issues to them. And they're able to say, okay, we'll talk about that, we'll ponder that, we'll work on it. And then the next week, they open it up to all of them. And there are times where we have congregational meetings because there are serious issues that need to be discussed. And they're not just coming down with a heavy hammer and saying, this is the way we're going to do things. They're being gracious teachers for us. And if you have questions or concerns or problems with the way things are going, I know they're approachable in all of that. Let me also make mention as a way of application. Not only, first of all, I think that's the primary thing, is that when we see men like that, and we've appointed men like that, we have men like that, then what we sign up for as a congregation, when we become a member here, we're signing up to not make their work burdensome, to not make it hard to be a gracious teacher, to be people who every day striving to be more shaped by the grace and teaching of Christ are a joy for them to shepherd. That's the first thing. That's the first application. The second thing is we are looking to continue to develop in that direction. When I look at this list, it becomes a model for me. The elders here have said, we want to continue shaping in that direction. We do the elders and deacons preparation class. We may not all become elders and deacons. Family situations may keep us from being in that particular place, or other circumstances may be. But that goal of being a kind of person who can be a gracious leader and teacher is a wonderful goal. You look at the qualifications for an elder, and there's not many of them that we don't all want to be. And so I say all of that to say that we are looking as a congregation to continue developing in that direction. Let me talk to you young men here who have spiritual direction, spiritual mindset, in the way that you treat your family, in the way that you go to work, in the way that you deal with the lost, in the way that you manage yourself. Allow God to train you and shape you to be a gracious teacher, so that one day you'll be prepared to be a gracious teacher, maybe over this local group or the local group that meets wherever it is that you live. Can we teach this to our children as well? Shaping them in matters like self-control, giving them examples of things like hospitality, showing in ourselves a devotion to what is good and righteous and sensible and holy. Can we teach them about the seriousness of holding fast to the word of truth? If we can do that, then we can continue to shape our children to see this. And if we can teach them faithfulness, then not only are we helping our own situation in being qualified, but we're helping them, and we're extending that decades down the road for this local group or other places. And then we want to continue to encourage and serve examples to those around us in our lives, in our devotion to the Lord. Lots of work being done here, I think, in trying to prepare people for down the line. So let's contribute our part as a parent, as a friend, as an encourager, as a grandparent, whatever we might be, whatever role we might be filling. Not only are we submitting and listening to our gracious teachers now, but we're trying to develop more along the way. Well, it may be that you have questions about all of that, and I would be happy to talk about them for sure, especially as we compare them to other places that we read about elders in the New Testament. But we can rejoice in the fact that for us, God's grace has reached us, and it is teaching us. The grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. Everyone in here stands with a gift right in front of them. Now, your choice is whether or not to open it. Your choice is whether or not to receive it. And if you receive it, that's no small thing. It's not just opening the gift and then moving on with your life. It is agreeing to the terms that you will be taught and shaped, not to live for worldly desires and for ungodliness, but to live soberly and righteously and godly in this present age. That you will live in hope, looking forward to the coming of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed and to purify for himself a people who are zealous for good work. You want God's grace? To be zealous for good works. That's what he wants to create, is a whole people. Not just here, but all over the world. People zealous for good works. If we can encourage you, if we can help you in all that, we would be delighted to. Won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.